You know, we love getting into the weeds on these complex topics, and today is no exception.
It's definitely complex.
We're looking at a 2023 report from the Toronto Police Service all about supporting Indigenous cultural safety within their ranks.
Yeah, they released this report outlining all these actions and initiatives.
It's pretty comprehensive. They really try to cover a lot of ground.
Yeah.
And I think that's what makes it so interesting. It's not just a surface level statement. It's a real attempt to grapple with some really tough questions.
For sure. I mean, like, how do you actually embed cultural safety in an organization as large and as complex as a police service?
Exactly. And I think that's what we're going to try to unpack today.
Yeah.
What does this actually look like in practice?
Right.
And the report itself starts with a land acknowledgement.
It does, which is pretty standard these days.
It is, but I think it's important to acknowledge the enduring presence of Indigenous peoples on this land. It sets the stage for the rest of the report, which really focuses on concrete actions.
Yeah.
So let's dive into some of the specifics.
Okay.
One of the first things that jumped out at me was their focus on recruitment.
Mm.
They're actively trying to attract more Indigenous officers.
Right.
And they're not just saying, oh, we want more diversity. They're actually taking steps to make that happen.
Yeah.
Like they're launching targeted campaigns.
Yep.
They're revising their job postings to be more inclusive.
Mm-hmm. Making sure they're using language that resonates with Indigenous applicants.
And they're making sure that their hiring channels are diverse.
Really important to have representation at every stage of the process.
And they're going to Indigenous hiring events and career fairs.
Trying to reach potential candidates where they are.
And what I found really interesting is they're actually tracking the percentage of underrepresented applicants.
Oh, wow.
And their success rate through the hiring process.
Right.
So they're not just hoping for the best, they're actually measuring their progress, which I think is key.
Yeah, accountability is so important.
It is, and that data will tell them if their efforts are actually leading to meaningful change.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how those numbers evolve over time.
For sure. But it's not just about getting people in the door, right?
Yeah.
They've got a whole section on training.
Yeah.
And this is where things get really interesting.
Okay.
All service members are required to undergo training on Indigenous experiences, fair and impartial policing, unconscious bias, you name it.
It's a lot to cover.
It is, but it's all essential for building cultural safety.
Right. It's about equipping officers with the knowledge and the skills to interact respectfully and appropriately with Indigenous communities.
And understanding their unique histories and experiences.
Exactly.
But they go even deeper than that.
Oh.
New recruits and newly promoted sergeants.
Okay.
They receive specific training on the history of police involvement in the oppression of Indigenous peoples.
Wow, that's a heavy topic.
It is. It's not an easy history to confront.
No, but it's a necessary step if they want to move towards reconciliation.
Right. Acknowledging that history, understanding the harm that was caused.
Yeah.
It's essential for building trust and changing the way policing is done.
Absolutely.
And it feels like they're trying to weave this understanding of Indigenous experiences into the very fabric of the police service. Like they're even developing immersive community experience programs.
Oh, wow.
For officers of all ranks.
Interesting.
So imagine officers working side by side with community agencies.
Yeah.
Learning firsthand about the challenges and realities faced by Indigenous people.
This could be really powerful.
Right. It's a far cry from just reading a textbook.
Yeah, for sure.
It's about building empathy, understanding relationships.
Those relationships are key.
They're the foundation for building trust and creating a safer, more inclusive environment.
For everyone.
Okay, so we've talked about recruitment and training. But what about the officers themselves?
Yeah.
How are they being supported within the police service? The report mentions the creation of something called the Aboriginal Internal Support Network, or AISN.
The AISN.
But I was wondering, what's the thinking behind that?
So it's recognizing that Indigenous officers might face unique challenges within the police service.
Oh, okay.
And the AISN provides a space for them to connect with each other, share their experiences, and advocate for their needs.
It's like a support system, a way to foster a sense of belonging within a system that hasn't always been welcoming to Indigenous voices.
Exactly. And it's not just about feeling supported.
Right.
It's also about creating pathways for advancement.
Okay.
The report talks about improving access to leadership development programs for underrepresented members.
So they're actively trying to cultivate Indigenous leadership within the police service.
Yeah.
That's a big deal.
It is, and it goes hand in hand with their efforts to revise the leadership promotion process. They're putting more emphasis on Indigenous and community experience.
Recognizing those are valuable assets for anyone in a leadership role.
Absolutely.
It's not just about climbing the ladder.
Right.
It's about having the right skills and understanding to lead in a culturally sensitive and equitable way.
For sure.
And they're taking it a step further by updating their performance management program to specifically assess how well leaders are supporting Indigenous cultural safety.
Wow.
That's huge.
It is.
It means that supporting cultural safety isn't just a suggestion.
Right.
It's a core part of how leaders are evaluated and held accountable.
And it sends a clear message that this is a priority.
Exactly. And to really drive this change, they've even created a dedicated working group of senior leaders focused on advancing Indigenous cultural safety. So it seems like they're putting some serious weight behind this commitment.
It does appear that way. They're tackling this on multiple fronts, from recruitment and training to leadership development and performance management. But of course, it all comes down to how these initiatives are implemented and what impact they have on the ground.
The proof is in the pudding, as they say.
Yeah, exactly.
Speaking of pudding, what about their actual policies and procedures? Are those changing to reflect this new emphasis on cultural safety?
Absolutely. They're weaving this recognition of Indigenous presence into the everyday operations. Like, for example, they now mandate starting all formal meetings with a land acknowledgement. And they're providing training on how to do so meaningfully.
Interesting.
It's a small gesture, but it's a symbolic shift in how they approach their work.
It's like they're trying to bake cultural sensitivity into their DNA.
Yeah, I like that analogy.
But they're going beyond symbolism, too. The report talks about publicly acknowledging the harm caused by the historical and current relationship between the justice system and Indigenous women and girls.
Yeah, that's a powerful statement.
It is admitting past wrongs is crucial for building trust.
And moving towards reconciliation.
And they're not stopping there. They're using equity impact assessments for all their operational plans to see how their actions might affect Indigenous communities.
That's a proactive approach.
It is trying to anticipate and mitigate potential harm before it happens.
It's a sign that they're taking this seriously.
They're also reviewing and revising their use of force procedures through a trauma-informed and Indigenous lens.
That's a hot button issue these days.
It is, but it's absolutely critical to examine those procedures and make sure they're aligned with the principles of cultural safety.
And by adopting a trauma-informed approach, they're recognizing that past trauma can have a significant impact on how people interact with law enforcement. And that calls for a more nuanced and sensitive approach.
And to help officers navigate these complex situations, they're creating a directory of Indigenous health and wellness professionals.
Oh, interesting.
That's a really interesting detail.
It shows they're thinking holistically. They're not just focusing on changing policies, but also on supporting the well-being of the officers who are implementing those changes.
It's about recognizing that this work can be emotionally and culturally challenging. And officers need access to the right resources
to do it effectively.
And compassionately.
Exactly. It's about supporting everyone involved in creating a more just and equitable system.
But it's not just about internal changes within the police service. They're also putting a lot of emphasis on community engagement. And that's where the real rubber meets the road, right? How are they actually building relationships and working with Indigenous communities?
How are they doing that?
That's a great question, and that's what we'll delve into next.
Sounds good. Well, they've developed this, Indigenous-specific engagement strategy. And it seems to be guiding their interactions with a whole range of stakeholders. Community organizations, leaders, elders, even experts with lived experience.
So they're really trying to get a broad range of perspectives.
Yeah, exactly. It's not just about talking to, the same old people.
Right. They're trying to reach out to the people who are actually affected by these issues.
Exactly. And it's not just about, sitting in boardrooms. They're also making an effort to be present in Indigenous communities.
How so?
Attending events like powwows and gatherings. Really trying to show up and build those face-to-face relationships.
It's about moving beyond the traditional image of law enforcement and becoming a part of the community fabric.
Exactly.
But how do they actually measure the impact of all these efforts?
Yeah, that's a good question.
They mentioned collecting race and identity-based data. How does that fit into the picture?
So that data is crucial for understanding how Indigenous people experience interactions with the police.
Okay.
It can reveal patterns of bias or disparities in how services are delivered.
So it's not just about collecting data for the sake of it. It's about using that data to drive real change.
Exactly. And they're taking it a step further by working with Indigenous organizations
Okay.
to develop alternative response models for people in crisis.
What does that mean?
So recognizing that the traditional police response isn't always the best approach,
Okay.
especially when dealing with mental health or substance use.
So instead of always sending armed officers,
Yeah.
they might partner with community organizations
Right.
that specialize in de-escalation and crisis intervention.
Exactly. It's a more compassionate and community-centered approach to public safety.
One that acknowledges the complexities of these situations.
Sure.
And it ties into their work with the City of Toronto on the Reconciliation Action Plan.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
They're not just working in isolation.
Right.
They're collaborating with other institutions to create a more equitable city for everyone.
That's a crucial point. Systemic change requires a collective effort. The police can't do it alone.
It's about breaking down silos and recognizing that everyone has a role to play in creating a more just and equitable society.
Absolutely.
So we've seen the plan, we've looked at the different initiatives, but how do we actually evaluate whether all of this is working?
Yeah. How do we know if it's making a difference?
What are the signs that the Toronto Police Service is truly embedding cultural safety into its operations?
That's a complex question, and there's no easy answer.
Right.
But I think one key indicator is trust.
Okay.
Has the relationship between the police and Indigenous communities improved? Do Indigenous people feel safer and more respected when interacting with law enforcement?
Trust is the foundation of any healthy relationship.
It is.
And it's been deeply eroded over generations of systemic racism and injustice.
Absolutely.
Rebuilding that trust is a long and difficult process.
It takes time and consistent effort.
And it requires more than just words or policies.
Right.
It requires consistent action transparency and a willingness to be held accountable.
Exactly.
One way to gauge this is by looking at how the police respond to criticism and feedback from Indigenous communities.
Yeah.
Are they open to hearing different perspectives?
Are they willing to admit when they've made mistakes?
Right.
And change their approach accordingly?
That humility and willingness to learn are essential for building genuine relationships.
It's about recognizing that they don't have all the answers and that they need to be constantly learning and adapting.
Another key indicator is whether these initiatives are actually leading to tangible improvements in the lives of Indigenous people.
Yeah.
Are they seeing a reduction in negative interactions with the police? Are they experiencing greater access to culturally relevant services and support?
So it's about outcomes, not just outputs.
Exactly. It's not enough to simply implement programs and policies.
Right.
We need to see real change on the ground.
And that change needs to be sustainable.
Okay.
Are these initiatives being integrated into the core culture of the police service? Or are they just temporary add-ons that could easily be abandoned in the future?
That's a crucial question. How do you ensure that cultural safety becomes a core value?
Yeah.
Something that's embedded in the DNA of the organization rather than just a box to be checked.
That's where leadership comes in.
Okay.
Are those in positions of power actively championing cultural safety? Are they holding themselves and others accountable for upholding these principles?
Are they creating a culture where Indigenous voices are not just heard, but truly valued and respected?
Those are the kinds of questions that we need to be asking if we want to see lasting change.
It's not just about implementing a checklist of initiatives. It's about creating a fundamental shift in the way the police interact with and serve Indigenous communities.
And that shift requires a deep understanding of the historical context. It requires acknowledging the harm that has been caused and committing to repairing those relationships.
Dismantling systems of oppression. Yeah.
And replacing them with systems of respect, equity, and justice.
It's a complex and challenging journey.
It is.
But it's one that we must undertake
if
we want to create a more just and equitable society for all.
And while this report focuses on the Toronto Police Service, these questions and challenges are relevant for police forces across the country.
Absolutely. It's a national conversation that we need to be having.
What are the lessons learned in Toronto that can be applied elsewhere?
Right.
How can we ensure that Indigenous cultural safety is a priority for all law enforcement agencies in Canada.
Those are important questions to ponder.
They are, and I think they're questions that we'll continue to explore as we move forward in this conversation. We've been talking about the Toronto Police Service and their efforts to really, make some changes.
Yeah.
But this isn't just about one police service, is it?
No, it's definitely not.
It's about a broader conversation about cultural safety and how we create a more just and equitable society.
So what can we as individuals take away from all of this?
Well, it's easy to think that systemic change is, solely the responsibility of these large institutions.
Right.
But cultural safety is something that we all have a role in creating.
So this isn't just a case of sit back and wait for the police to fix it.
No, definitely not.
What can we actively do?
Well, for starters, we can learn.
Okay.
Educate ourselves about the history of Indigenous peoples in Canada. The ongoing effects of colonization, the nuances of systemic racism.
That sounds like a lot more than just a quick Google search.
Yeah.
Where do we even begin?
There's so many resources available,
Like what?
books by Indigenous authors, documentaries, podcasts, even attending community events or lectures. It's about actively seeking out diverse perspectives.
Right.
And really listening to the stories being shared.
So it's not just about knowing the facts.
Right.
It's about understanding the lived experiences and the human impact of these issues.
Exactly. And once we have that understanding, we can start to examine our own biases.
Or bias.
We all have them, often unconscious.
Yeah.
And they can influence how we interact with others and how we perceive the world.
So that's where the real work begins.
Yeah.
Confronting those internal biases and challenging our own assumptions.
It can be uncomfortable.
Right.
But it's necessary if we want to be true allies.
And it doesn't stop there, right?
No, it doesn't.
What else can we do?
We can support Indigenous-led organizations and initiatives in our communities.
So donating to a cause, volunteering our time, or even just spreading awareness about the work they're doing.
Exactly. Even small actions can make a difference. And don't underestimate the power of advocacy. We can speak up against injustice, challenge discriminatory language, and push for policies that promote equity and inclusion.
In our workplaces, schools, and communities.
Exactly. It's about using our voices to amplify the voices of those who are often marginalized and silenced.
It's about being an active participant in creating change.
Yeah.
Rather than a passive observer.
And ultimately, it's about building relationships.
Good.
Engaging in meaningful dialogue with Indigenous people. Listening to their stories, learning from their perspectives, and forming connections based on mutual respect and understanding.
It sounds like cultural safety is a multifaceted journey.
It is.
One that requires continuous learning, self-reflection, and action.
It's not a destination.
Right.
It's a process of growth and understanding.
Precisely. And it's a journey we all need to be on together.
Yeah. We can't just sit back and wait for institutions to fix these systemic issues.
Right.
It requires individual effort, collective action, and a shared commitment to creating a more just and equitable society.